I'm Dan, and I'm an alcoholic. So, yesterday we talked about the fourth step, and it's something I'm really passionate about, obviously. But I bet you guys thought I forgot about sex. There's also fears and sex to talk about in the fourth step, and I'd like to touch on those just to kind of finish up with that fourth step inventory process. After we've got all this stuff down on the resentment inventory, it goes on to say on the bottom of page 67, it says, notice the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties, right? So it's implying here that we've already done this, right? Because if I've put the fears next to the third column, like we talked about, right? What I've done is I've bracketed that word fear alongside the difficulties. Now, self-esteem and pride, ambition and security, personal relations and sex relations and money, those are not my difficulties, right? You could look at the chart here on page 65, and you see that fear is next to those terms. But at the bottom where it says, when we were finished, we considered it carefully. So we considered how those 7 areas of self affected us and put the fear next to what we considered. And our thinking is what they're referring to as our difficulties. All right? The fear is attached to how I feel about self-esteem, right? Or what I think about pride, or what I think about ambition or security, or these 7 areas of self. So when it says, notice the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties, right? That's what we've already done. And it says that this short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives, right? We've listed 7 aspects of our lives, right? And we've seen that fear could be connected with each one of those. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. Here it says that the fear set in motion trains of circumstances. After you've done this, if you look over your list of fears that you've put next to the difficulties and ask yourself, what would this third column look like? What would my thinking look like if I didn't have the fear next to it? Right? Because if I didn't have that fear, then when column 1 does column 2, I'd have neutrality. Right? But because these things are driven by these fears, right, it sets in motion these trains of circumstances, which brought us misfortune that we felt we didn't deserve. It says, but did we not set our... But did we not... I'm sorry. Still early. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Question mark. Right. Here it's saying that there's something that I'm doing here in relationship to the resentment, right? And in relationship to the fear. It says we think that fear ought to be classed with stealing. And if you think about it, how fear, when it says that fear ought to be classed with stealing, hasn't fear robbed you of the life that you might have had if you didn't live in fear? Hasn't that been the thing that stopped you from having those relationships or doing those things that you've always thought you wanted to do? Right? Hasn't it controlled your destiny? Right? Hasn't it robbed you of the life that you might have had? It says fear seems to cause more trouble. So we reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we had no resentment in connection with them. We asked ourselves why we had them. And what I like to do is list all the fears from all of the pages of inventory into one column. And next to each one, ask myself, why did I have this fear? And then I'll make another column, right? And just use one fear out of the second column and just ask myself, why did I have this fear? And it goes something like this, right? I'm afraid that I'm not good enough, because if I'm not good enough, then you won't want me. I'm afraid I'm afraid of being unwanted, because if I'm unwanted, then I'll be alone. Now, maybe if I'm afraid of being alone, it's because I don't want to be alone because of the way it feels when you're alone, right? The emotional pain of being alone. So then I ask myself, well, why do I have that fear? Why am I afraid of that emotional pain? It's if I sit in emotional pain long enough, right, I could drink over that, right? Emotional pain could separate you from that power. If I sit in emotional pain long enough, I could drink again. And for me, to drink is to die, and that's why I would be afraid of drinking again. For me to drink is to die. So why would I be afraid of dying? I don't know. Maybe that's just it, because I don't know what that means. I'm afraid of what maybe is on the other side of that. And why would I be afraid of what would be on the other side of dying? Right? Maybe it's because I'm afraid that it won't be any better than what it is here. Well, and why would that be? Because I don't believe deep down inside that there's really a God on the other side. That there is nothing on the other side. Right? And ultimately, if I really deep down underneath believe that there is no God on the other side of all this, then there's nothing left for me but to resort to my own power, which is how I've always lived. Right? And fear comes from that place. That fear doesn't, and the kind of fears we're talking about doesn't come from out here, outside of us. It comes from inside. My fears are that there's some part of me that's just not going to have enough to accomplish what I think I need out here. Right? I manufacture those fears inside of me. They come from inside of me, and what they come from is exactly what it says on the next line. Wasn't it because self-reliance failed us? Right? Because if I didn't fear that self-reliance would fail me, right, then I wouldn't need to turn to another power. Self-reliance was as good as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. Some of us once had great self-confidence, but it didn't fully solve the fear problem, or any other. And when fear made me cocky, it was worse. Right? Haven't you taken actions based in fear, right, that comes out as looking aggressive or cocky and just really made things worse? But really what you are is afraid inside. Right? Standing up for things, trying to protect yourself from things that you can't protect yourself from, or you shouldn't be protecting yourself from. Right? Fears that cause harm. Right? We look for that too. How do my fears cause harm? It says perhaps there's a better way. We think so, for we are now on a different basis. The basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. I like this line where it says, we are in the world to play the role that He assigns. Look how the inventory has shown us how we've been in the world, assigning roles to everybody and how you're supposed to be, and if you would, and how situations around us are supposed to look. You know, the lights, the cameras, the setting the stage, how we think we need life to be okay. We've been in the world assigning roles, and we've never been able to find that life that we thought we would hopefully get one day, that would just give us that philosophy of life that comforts us. So just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. It doesn't say that we won't have calamity in our life. You know, you can go through this process, you can be on a spiritual path, and life happens. Right? So my real solution is not the world becoming perfect, but me having a kit of spiritual tools that I can use in my life, right? That will match my calamities with serenity. It says we never apologize for anyone for depending upon our Creator. We can laugh at those who think spirituality is the way of weakness. Paradoxically, it is the way of strength. And I never quite grasped that. I mean, the theory was here for me at this point, but it was much later in the process that I really, really had an experience with this. Specifically in step 9. It says, all men of faith have courage. Right? If I didn't have fear, then I wouldn't need courage. I don't believe that this process is about being in a place one day that I have no fears. Right? But the process has proven to give me courage. Right? And that's what I really need. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. We ask Him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be. Right? And that becomes a great prayer. In fact, it's my favorite prayer. And that goes, God, please remove my fear and direct my attention to what you would have me be. And I get a lot of people call me and people I work with, and they're confused about which way to go. And you'll hear things like, well, what do you think God wants me to do? Right? Like I should know, right? And I just simply direct them back to what it says here. I don't think God cares what job I'm in or what relationship I'm in. I think God cares how I behave in the world. Right? I may not like the job, but how am I acting at the job? God, please remove my fear and direct my attention to what you would have me be here in this job, in this relationship, right? In this meeting. It means it's a lot. It makes a lot more sense, and it's a lot less confusing to approach it from that perspective. Right? And it says at once we commence to outgrow fear. As I develop more faith in this power, then I'll experience that. I trust that the power comes if I turn to it. So now, about sex. Everybody's too quiet, too tired to react to that. There's 9 questions on the next page where it says we reviewed our own conduct over the past years. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Whom had we hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Where were we at fault? What should we have done instead? We got all this down on paper and looked at it. It's in the middle of 69. Now, it's interesting that it fell on page 69, hasn't it? Now, some people would think they did that on purpose. I would have figured that they did that on purpose, but the fact is, if you turn to the Big Book Awakening, if you got one, and turn to page 69, it's the sex inventory. And I didn't do it on purpose. It just worked out that way. So, I swear I didn't do it on purpose. Although it has made it hesitant for me to slip anything before it, though. So what I do, there's a guide sheet in the Big Book Awakening, or if you want to download it off of my website, it's at thejaywalker.com. If you look for, I think it says 4-step workshop examples or something like that. Somebody downloaded them last night, but it's got some examples of the inventory and some blank sheets that you could print out for doing this. Makes it a little easier to use the guide sheets, especially when you're new at it, because you can kind of follow the instructions. And but for the sex inventory, on the first page, we just write down a little bit of history. How did this relationship start? Let me point this out too. On the sex inventory, it's not about sex acts. It's about my conduct in relationships. Right? I've had people that I haven't worked with ask me to listen to their fifth step, and that's what I got is explanations on their virility. Right? Right? That's not what the sex inventory is about. It's about my conduct in relationships. So, on the first page, I asked them to just do a brief history. How did this start? Major points that came up in the relationship, right? And how did it end, or how is it now? And it doesn't have to be this novel, right? It's just so that when you're reading inventory, you can bottom line and say, this is kind of what happened. And then on the other side of the page is these 9 questions. How have I been selfish? Or where had I been selfish? Where had I been dishonest? Where had I been inconsiderate? Whom had I hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, arouse suspicion, or arouse bitterness? Where were we at fault? And the last question, question 9, what should we have done instead? Now, I know that the easy answer is shouldn't have got involved in the first place. Right? But that really sidesteps the real question. What should I have done instead in the relationship? Right? And I look around the relationship with these questions, because maybe there's other friends or family members that were hurt as a result of my behavior. At the bottom, if I see any harm, at the bottom I write any specific harm that I caused during the relationship. Right? And one thing was consistent through all of these relationships, and all of this stuff that I've listed and wrote out, because I made this first time I made this list from the oldest relationship I could think of, right, up until the present relationship. And one thing was really consistent throughout all of them, that I was in them. I was in them, and unless my behavior changed, right, none of that would have changed. And it really isn't about changing what is behind me. It's about moving forward from this place, awake to how I behave, what my conduct is in relationships. Right? But one of the things that I have to see is that I didn't have the ability to be any better than I was in the relationship. Right? Over and over again, Dan will be Dan. Right? This next part will address that. It says in the middle of 69, where it says, in this way we tried to shape a sane and sound ideal for our future sex life. We subjected each relationship to the test. Was it selfish or not? We asked God to mold our ideals and to help us live up to them. So I write what I call a sex ideal. And when I say a sex ideal, it's not what you want your mate to look like. Right? I've seen it. I've seen people. I specifically use question 9. What should I have done instead in the relationship? I write a prayer based on all of the question 9s that I've written from all of the relationships that I've had, that I wrote on. And I turn it into a prayer. God, in the future, please help me, ... Right? And I list the things that I see, the behaviors that I see that I repeat and that I can't not do on my own. Right? Because we're starting to look at the things that we need to do, the things that we need to turn to the Spirit for more power. Right? And certainly if you're newer and you're not at that place yet, and you have a problem with the idea of needing this power greater than yourself, you can easily look at it from the perspective of, can I see that if I continue with the power that I've got, I'll continue working out from the same place that I've always worked from, that I haven't had the ability to do better. Right? And the hope is that deep down, somewhere throughout this process, we're going to learn how to tap into a power that will move us beyond our own. Right? So as I told you, at the end of each section, to kind of like bottom line it for you, and then, right, in 70, the last paragraph in 70 where it's if we, it says, if we have been thorough about our personal inventory, we have written down a lot. We have listed and analyzed our resentments. We have begun to comprehend their futility and their fatality. We have commenced to see their terrible destructiveness. We have begun to learn tolerance, patience, and goodwill towards all men, even our enemies. For we look on them as sick people. We have listed the people we have hurt by our conduct and are willing to straighten out the past if we can. Right? So, step 5, in 72. It says, having made our personal inventory, what shall we do about it? Now it's going to tell me what I've been trying to get. If we have been trying to get a new attitude, a new relationship with our Creator, and to discover the obstacles in our path. Right? That's what we've been trying to do through the inventory process. We have admitted certain defects. Here it says, we've admitted certain defects in the inventory. Right? Some people like to make lists of things that while they're listening to a fifth step. But here it says that we have admitted certain defects through the inventory process. So if you look up one of the definitions of character, we usually refer to them as defects of character, right? Character, like if you look at a character on a stage, which is the kind of the theme that he's been holding to throughout this last chapter. When somebody's in character, they're behaving a certain way, right? So the defects in their character would be the defects in the way they're behaving. So as you're going through the inventory process, you might pull out things like controlling, manipulative, right? Untrustworthy, right? The things that you kind of hear people talk about their character, as their character defects. So where have you seen those in the inventory process? Right? What I say is, you look at your behavior. If you take all of those types of character defects that you'd list like that, it's going to fall under 2 categories. My thinking and my actions. Right? My thinking and my actions. And we looked at our selfish thinking and actions in the 4th column under self-seeking and selfishness. Right? You don't have to reduce a character defect into one word. You've written them all out in your self-seeking actions and your selfish behavior right here in the fourth column. Right? It says we have ascertained in a rough way what the trouble is, and we have put our finger on the weak items in our personal inventory. Hopefully you've seen that it's behavior that's recurring. Right? Now these are about to be cast out. This requires action on our part. Let me make another note, and that is, there's another word where it talks about, uses the word cast, and that's in Carl Jung's description of what a spiritual experience looks like. Right? Where it talks about ideas, emotions, and attitudes which were once the guiding forces in the lives of these men suddenly cast to one side, right? And a new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. Right? These require actions on our part, which, when completed, will mean that we have admitted to God to ourselves and to another human being the exact nature of our defects. So here it uses the word defects twice, but here it's calling them the nature of our defects. For example, how I define that is, my drinking problem is out here, right? I get drunk, I drive drunk, I lose my job, I screw up relationships. It's the things that we do drunk. The nature of my problem is in here. I have a spiritual malady that sets up a condition conducive for obsessions to return, and I drink again and I lose control. That's all inside. The nature of my alcoholism is an internal problem, right? In the page 52, where it talks about having problems with our emotional natures, right? I talked about it there too. Problems with my emotions are out here, but the problem with my emotional natures are inside. So here it's the same thing. I look at this, the nature of my defects as a part of this that's inside, not outside. And my selfish attitude that I put out there and my selfish actions are all out here. But it tells me that I have to get in touch with the nature of the problem, the nature of those defects. And I'm going to see that in the bottom of the fourth column in my fears and dishonesty. Those are the nature of my problem. Because remember, we talked about how those things are underneath my attitude and my actions. Right? I can work on my actions. I can work on my attitude. Right? But I might work on them over here with you, and they might come out over here with them, right? What I have to see is that there's a part of this that I absolutely cannot work on, and it's deep down inside of me, right? And we discuss this through this fifth step process as we're reading each page of inventory, right? I have deep-seated fears. Things that I grew up with, influences that happened when I was young and all through life. Wherever they came from, they're things that are so deeply ingrained in me, I have to see that I can't do anything about those. Right? And out of those deep-seated fears comes these self-delusions, the lies that I tell myself, things that I feel I need to protect. Right? And out of these delusions that come from those fears come an attitude, a selfish attitude, which I exhibit out here to you, right? And the actions I take based on that attitude and self-seeking actions, right? Those are the nature of my defects, and those are the parts that through the inventory process we discuss certain things, and here's what I found really helpful when you're listening to a fifth step. I'm going to jump ahead to the sixth step, where it says we have emphasized willingness as being indispensable. We're now ready to let God remove from us all the things we've admitted are objectionable. So through each page of inventory, as we're going through the fifth step, I ask a simple question: do you find this behavior objectionable? Not whether they were right or wrong, but you're where you were to blame in the interaction. What you looked at in the fourth column. Can you see that do you find that your behavior in this interaction is objectionable? It says, can he now take them all, every one? Right? Can I do anything about it on my own? That would be the next question. Can you see that you could not behave any differently than you did when this situation happened that you're writing about? Right? Because I have to see that if I can't do anything about it on my own, then I'm going to have to turn to something else for more power. Right? It says if we're still clinging to something we will not let go, we ask God to help us be willing. Is there any resentments or behavior, right, that you're still clinging to, that you're not willing to let go of? Right? It says we ask God to help us be willing. Right? But all it's saying here is we're asking God to help us be willing. It's not saying that before we move on, we have to have all this behavior removed. It's not quite that easy. Right? And certainly before you read this inventory, it should be with someone that you trust, someone that you know is not going to carry all your stuff through the rooms. You know, did you hear about him? I heard his fifth step. You know, because there's certain parts of this that are going to be really personal. There is a part here in preparation for the fifth step where I asked the people that I'm working with to write down any secrets that they told themselves they take to the grave. The things that you stuffed down way deep inside that you said you'd never let anybody hear. Right? I had a few of those, but I wrote them in code on the back of the book because I really wasn't really sure that I was wanting to actually mention them. After I read my inventory to my sponsor, he says, "Is that it?" I said, "That's it." Right? He says, and he gave me my next instructions and sent me off on my way, and I was blocked. I couldn't move on. I had to call him up and say, that wasn't it. And he did what he always did. I'm sure it wasn't just to me. I think it was just something he did, but he grunted. Ugh. Right. And he says, "Well, come on back over." Right. And after I shared that with him, the response was, "Is that it?" That was it. And that's really about the way it was. I mean, looking back, it was kind of dumb to not want to share that, right? But and certainly I've heard way worse things than I had, and it's weird. I can't even remember any of them right now. Not that I would share them with you, but it just you won't tell anybody. All right. So I've never really been willing to tell everybody my whole story or everything about me. But what gets laid out in this inventory is just all of the truth about our behavior and the truth about the way we think and the stuff that drives us, and it can be really exposing for some people, and at the same time, the experience of finishing the fifth step can be amazingly freeing, right? Amazingly freeing, because it starts to clear away all this stuff that blocks us from the sunlight of the Spirit, right? And that's become my only job today, really, is keeping that pipe clean. Because then you start to live your life, and just things happen, and other people do whatever people do, and life takes the turns that they turn, and we develop more inventory, right? So just because we finished a fourth step doesn't mean it's over. We've been given a spiritual tool and encouraged to plug it into something. It's a spiritual power tool, right? And it works so well that incorporating it into our life is what they're going to start to direct us to do, right? So on 75 is the starting instructions. We pocket our pride and go to it, illuminating every twist of character, every dark cranny of the past. And once we have taken this step, withholding nothing, we are delighted. Right? I was certainly delighted to be done with that thing. I was not necessarily the fastest person in inventory. I'm guilty of balking. I would sit down and I would write one and just be exhausted, right? And that's why when I told you about just feeding it a little bit at a time, a piece at a time, it actually seems like a lot more work, and it actually is more work doing it that way. But because it's just in pieces, it seems to, it just seems to end up faster, right? And it is more work because as you get down to the bottom of the columns, you have to review what you did before, right? So it is more work that way. It just doesn't feel like it. And the accountability of coming every week gets it done. Because the important thing is to get it finished, to fifth step it, and to see what we need to see, right? And I certainly don't think taking the 2 years I took in doing it is beneficial, right? So when I come down on my sponsees for when they're taking too long, it's out of experience, it's not out of judgment. It doesn't have to take this long, and it's better to get it done. So once we have taken this step withholding nothing, we are delighted. We can look the world in the eye. We can be alone in perfect peace and ease. Our fears fall from us. We begin to feel the nearness of our Creator. Oh, let me make a comment on that part where it says our fears fall from us. When we understand where fear comes from and the part it plays in our resentment, right? Part of the experience of finishing the inventory is when column 1 does column 2, I can just say, jerk, and walk on, right? Instead of bringing it into my life and making it a part of my day, right? Being resentful at what that person did, right? And that is a result of the fear that's powering the thinking falling from me, right? When I understand where fears come from, right? We begin to feel the nearness of our Creator, right? When we don't have all of this stuff in between that relationship, when I don't have all that stuff in my head, right? My attention gets directed in other places, right? We may have had certain spiritual beliefs, but now we begin to have a spiritual experience. The feeling that the drink problem has disappeared will often come strongly. We feel that we're on the broad highway, walking hand in hand with the Spirit of the universe. Nowhere in the book does it say the road narrows. Right? Anything I read in here directs me towards nothing less than thinking that this just grows and has the potential to get bigger, right? The more I write inventory, the more I understand my own thinking. The more I understand that, and the things that are driving it. The more I understand that, and the more I help working with others and explaining this to them, right? The more I understand what's driving my own thinking and the way that I think, right? If you want to learn something well, teach it, right? And I know that if you've glanced over this or listened to me yesterday and what I talked about today, it almost starts to look like a math class and your eyes glaze over and you just go, too much, right? This will move you, though. This will move you. This is the kind of inventory that will force you to think about certain things, and you will get better at it. And as you get better at it, you will grow spiritually doing it, because you'll be able to see yourself better. When somebody has a resentment that they can't let go of, I've also found that it's helpful to do what I call a reverse inventory, right? If I'm mad at somebody, I'll write inventory for them, right? I write my name in the first column, and then the second column sometimes I'll do this in the fifth step, if they're clinging to a resentment, my name in the first column, and then I say, okay, well, what would they be mad at me about? So I'll write that in the second column. And then I go down the third column, just using my intuition as to what would come to me as far as the thinking in relationship to the cause of the resentment. And I attached the fear next to each one of those 7 areas of self. And you see how fears drive other people's thinking and behavior, right? Just like it does yours, right? So, let's see. Okay, good. Just checking the time here. All right. In the bottom, the last paragraph of 75. I keep saying all the way through the book, making the point that as it switches from one section to another, there'll be like an introduction either that sums up what you just passed through or what's to come. How many people think that step 6 is only one paragraph? All right? Most people do. Unless you start it from the paragraph before. Right? Because it doesn't look like too much to do here, does it? Right? I've heard people call it the forgotten steps, 6 and 7. I've heard people say, oh, there's not much to do there anyway. You know. But listen, if you start from the paragraph before, returning home, we find a place where we can be quiet for an hour. Right? And it does just say an hour. Right? Sometimes you send people home and you call and you haven't heard from them in 3 days, and it's like, it said an hour. Right? Carefully reviewing what we've done. We thank God from the bottom of our heart that we know Him better. Right? The closer I get to my own truth, the better I know what God would have me be. Taking this book down from the shelf, we turn to the page which contains the 12 steps. I've had sponsees that have told me that they put the book back on the shelf just so they could take it down. Yeah. I've been known to sponsor some obsessive people. Carefully reading the first 5 proposals, we ask ourselves have we admitted anything, for we're building an arch through which we shall walk a free man at last. Right? So here it says we reviewed the first 5 proposals. All of a sudden it's not so small anymore, is it? Right? And in an effort to make sure that they don't make too big a deal of this, I turn to the considerations for step 6 that I use. And I asked them, I says, do you find step 1, the behavior that you exhibited, that you became clear of in step 1, objectionable in your life? Right? Obviously, yes. Hopefully, they see that by this point. Can you see you can't do anything about it on your own? You couldn't keep yourself sober on your own? Right? And that you need to turn to a power to help you with that? Right? Is there anything here you're clinging to that you saw in step 1? Hopefully not by this point. Are you willing to turn to God for help with that from now on? Right? What about step 2 and your agnosticism? Do you find today in your current life, in the direction you're going, that agnosticism would be objectionable? Right? Can you see that you cannot be any more less agnostic on your own power? Right? Are you willing to turn to God for help with that? Right? Is there any part of agnosticism that you're still clinging to, that you're not willing to let go of? Right? Or can you really just turn to God completely for the willingness to be less agnostic? Again, nowhere does it imply here that we're going to never be agnostic or never have agnostic behavior again. Right? And I think that's sometimes where people think that means they gave back the 3rd step prayer and took it back and gave it back, or whatever, however they say that. Right? That's just part of a spiritual path. It's just not a straight line. It veers back and forth across a straight line. What about step 3, and you're playing God and thinking that self-reliance is going to work for you? That first requirement in the third step. Can you find that playing God in your life today and in a spiritual path would be objectionable? And can you see that you can't do anything about that on your own? You cannot play God less on your own power. Right? Is there any part of playing God that you're still clinging to? Right? Are you willing to turn to God for help with that? Right? Then we get up to step 4. And this is the part I send them home with, because after hearing a 5th step, I certainly don't want to hear it all again. Right? But they got to take responsibility for their own spiritual path. So this is what I ask them to do, is just go home and look at each person that you wrote inventory on. And in a contemplative type of meditation, just picture the interaction in your mind. Picture them standing face to face with you and this thing happening. And ask yourself, with this picture in your mind of this, like they're in front of you, can I see that my behavior with this person was objectionable? Can I see that I couldn't behave any different in this interaction on my own power? Right? Is there anything here that I'm still clinging to that I'm not willing to let go of in this interaction? Right? And am I willing to turn to God with help for all of this? Right? Not necessarily from the past, but from now on. I draw a line through 6 and 7. Right? What we're looking at here is everything we've seen from the first 5 proposals, all through the 4th step, and discussed in the 5th step. Right? All this stuff from the past I cannot change. Right? Certainly the harms get addressed afterwards, but my behavior I cannot take back. It's out there. Right? Right? But moving on, right? That first 2 words in the next paragraph is when ready. Right? Because when ready, some people say that, well, the 7th step is just a prayer. That's only true if you're ready. Because if you're not ready, then it's just words. It's not even a prayer. Right? I have to be clear that I see that the objectionable nature of my behavior, and that I couldn't do anything about that on my own power, and really want to move beyond this place and get what the people in my home group said they got, the people that went before me, what they said they got out of this. I want more. Right? I had to become completely ready. And when I was ready, it was only then was I told I should say the prayer. And unlike the 3rd step prayer that I do with the people I work with, for the 7th step prayer, I tell them to find a peaceful place to go on their own. Because see, there's something different about this prayer than the other one. Right? There's an immense power that's going to come from 6 and 7 if it's done a certain way. Right? This, a lot of people talk about 10 and 11, and that's just about maintaining a particular way of life and practicing growing that way of life. Here's where it happens. Here's where that line shift in my whole life takes place, where I see that this life of living on my own power comes to this line right here. And when I'm ready, from now on, to turn to God for everything, right? Only then am I going to say this prayer, which is, my Creator, I'm now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. And that I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character. Now, look at this. Which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Nowhere does it say here that all my character defects are going to be removed. Right? It says, grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Amen. We have then completed step 7. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because I think from one perspective, my biggest defect of character was my alcoholism, and God never removed that, just suppressed that problem. And that's become what God uses as a tool to attract other alcoholics. Other defects of character will attract other people with the same defects of character, right? Because there's a sense that those people will understand where I'm coming from. But the hope is that they have that behavior and they've got over it. They found a solution, right? That's what makes it more attractive. So just because I do this doesn't mean all of a sudden I'm supposed to be perfect or get hung up on my behavior that I'm still exhibiting. But I certainly have to be ready to turn to God for help with this. Right? And when I talk about this with the people I work with, I talk about it in relationship. I talk about it as like a new relationship, right? Because you're making this commitment to a relationship, right? Really living a way that's where I'm participating in this relationship means that I have to, as things happen, bring that into my day, right? I'm saying here that I'm willing to turn to God, but that means I have to turn to God, right? A lot of people miss that. When you ask somebody if they pray, what would they tell you? Yeah, I wake up in the morning and I pray, and before I go to bed, I thank God for my day. Well, if you think about it, try that with your wife or boyfriend or girlfriend or husband. Just wake up in the morning, say good morning, and don't say anything all day, and just say good night at the end of the day. What kind of relationship will you have? Right? You feel disconnected? That's why. Right? Right? And that doesn't mean at this point that I even understood completely what God was. There was still that little voice in the back of my mind that says, I don't know if this is really going to happen to me, for me. Right? I didn't know what it would look like. I just didn't know. But I certainly knew what I've seen up to this point in this process. I didn't know necessarily what God was completely yet, but I certainly know who Dan was and what Dan's limitations were and what Dan needed help with. And I saw that I could not grow from this point just on my own power. I was convinced of that. And my commitment to this relationship was based on a leap of faith, right? And it really helped me to come to a real easy definition of faith, right? And faith is belief with doubt. Belief with doubt, right? Because if I didn't have any doubt, then I wouldn't have to consider it faith. They would just know. I had a strong sense of faith at that point, right? But it was accompanied by some doubt, right? But the truth about alcoholism was stronger than the fear about the truth about alcoholism and the fear of living just on the power I'd been living on was bigger than my concerns about whether or not there's really something here. Because by this point, deep down inside, I really wanted there to be something, and by the time I said this prayer, I actually started to look around at the religion that I grew up with and started reading more books because I wanted to kind of come to some kind of conclusion. I thought that if I picked up the right book, I'd be able to explain God to a T, and then I'd be able to really understand it and buy the whole package completely. Right? But I had to just settle for faith at this point, right? Because that's all there was, right? But I couldn't deny that my life was certainly many times better than it was when I first got here. And not just from meetings, but from an awakening that was produced by each step. It was a different awakening produced by each step, right? And not necessarily the comfortable kind, right? It was, and I've said it before, and I'll probably say it again before the end of the day. It's spiritual experience of the painful variety. It wasn't painful to see the truth of step one. I mean, didn't feel good to see the truth of step one. It was painful, right? To see that I couldn't rely on my own power in step two, that I had to have some other power that I didn't understand, that was baffling to me. Like, how could I ever do that, right? I couldn't. It's saying I can't rely on myself, right? And I see that I don't want to continue to play God in step three, and I had to make this decision for this thing that I absolutely didn't know that I want, because I didn't come to this thing out of virtue. I didn't want to be full of God. I just wanted to not drink, right? And then going through the 4-step process, that was painful. Seeing the truth about myself, and then seeing the things that are driving it, and that part of that was creating all of that stuff was still in me, and that I couldn't do anything about it on my own, right? Spiritual awakening of the painful variety. But those are the kind that move me forward. Right? If it felt good, I'd sit. If step one felt good, I'd probably stay in step one. Right? So there's this big shift from powerlessness to reaching for power in step 7. Right? And that's what it's about here. Right? That becomes the way that I want to live now. Right? No longer powerless. I want to live a life with power. You hear people in meetings say, I work all the steps every day. Not this way, they didn't. Right? I couldn't do this every day. Right? But then I also don't feel like it makes a lot of sense to me, because I can't say at this point that I'm powerless. I just have to know where the power is coming from. Right? So I'm going to stop there for the next break, and we're going to come back at 11 o'clock. All right? Thank you.